Hello, everyone. If one summer could redraw the upper Mississippi, it was 1832. Follow the orders, the supply boats, and the fate of the British band. April 1832, Rock River Country, Illinois. A small Sauk and Meskwaki refugee band under Black Hawk steps back into fields they once planted near Sauk, carrying elders, children, and a few hundred armed men. Across the Mississippi at Fort Armstrong, United States regulars under Henry Atkinson receive orders to remove them. In Springfield, Governor John Reynolds issues a call for mounted volunteers. The frontier is wet with spring floods, the roads are clay and ruts, and rumors move faster than couriers. Keokuk warns against the crossing. Wabokieshiek, the prophet, promises influence upstream. The British band goes anyway, searching for food and allies along the Rock River. This episode asks a narrow question with wide consequences. Why did American militia and army columns pursue this band across Illinois into the Wisconsin River Valley, and why did the chase not stop until the water at the Bad Axe ran thick with wrecked rafts? The answer touches treaties and logistics more than speeches. The United States treats an 1804 St. Louis cession as binding and removal as policy. Settlers near creeks and prairies fear renewed war and armed blockhouses. The Army holds the river line and can feed men and horses. The band moves light short of powder and corn tied to families and wagons. The actors are clear. Black Hawk leads veterans and kin who reject the loss of Saukenuk. Atkinson coordinates regulars and volunteers who gather in thousands as news spreads. Henry Dodge and other mounted officers learn the ground from the lead mines to Lake Koshkonong. Scouts on both sides trade fire along groves and ridges whose names will later mark skirmishes. The stakes reach beyond a single summer. Control of the Rock River country. The pace of removal in the upper Mississippi and the habits of frontier war will all be set in part by what happens between Stillmans Run and the mouth of the Bad Axe. The deep cause lay in a paper line drawn in 1804. A Sauk delegation signed a cession at St. Louis that United States officials later treated as binding over millions of acres in Illinois and Wisconsin. Black Hawk denied its legitimacy for the rest of his life. He held that no full council had consented, and that Saukenuk on the Rock River remained his home. United States agents filed the deed and acted to clear titles as settlers advanced. War left marks on loyalty and supply. During the War of 1812, Black Hawk fought with British allies around the Great Lakes. He kept ties with traders at Green Bay and Prairie du Chien. Those relationships fed his belief that help might return if he stood fast. After 1815, the British flag no longer protected native villages in the upper Mississippi. Trade licenses and rations moved under United States control. Settlement pressure rose year by year. Illinois became a state in 1818. Lead discoveries near Galena drew thousands by the mid-1820s. Prairie farms spread along rivers and groves in the Rock River country. Game declined near fields and roads. Fence lines cut travel paths. The Sauk and Meskwaki dependence on corn and seasonal hunts grew harder to sustain near new towns. Administration also changed. In 1824, the Office of Indian Affairs formed under the War Department. Agents implemented treaty terms and removal orders. They used annuities rations and travel permits to steer movement. Rock Island Agency personnel reported constant friction near Saukenuk in the late 1820s. Keokuk worked with the agency to avoid open war and to secure food west of the Mississippi. Black Hawk refused the shift. Policy hardened with the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Federal law endorsed the exchange of lands east of the Mississippi for tracts to the west. Illinois leaders pressed for rapid execution in the Rock River Valley. County lines and surveys advanced. The space for compromise narrowed. Each spring brought new cabins closer to the old fields at Saukenuk. The immediate prelude began in 1831. In June, Black Hawk led families back to plant corn near the village site. Illinois militia mustered. Regulars at Fort Armstrong supported the call. Black Hawk withdrew across the Mississippi, under pressure later that summer. Hunger and humiliation followed in winter camps west of the river. Crops there were poor. Hunting grounds were crowded with other displaced bands. Old people suffered. Black Hawk resolved to return in the spring. Orders and warnings crossed in early 1832. Agents told Black Hawk that any eastward move would be treated as a hostile act. Keokuk warned that no strong alliance stood ready on the Rock River. Wabokieshiek, the prophet, offered influence among villages upriver. Black Hawk believed that Potawatomi or Ho-Chunk support might form once he arrived. He named his followers the British Band to signal old ties and to stiffen morale. The trigger was the April crossing. Black Hawk ferried elders, women, children, and 300 to 500 armed men to the east bank, near the mouth of the Rock River. He intended to reach planted fields and friendly ground near Prophetstown. United States officials read the move as a violation of the 1804 cession and the removal commitments made the previous year. Governor John Reynolds issued a call for mounted volunteers. General Henry Atkinson prepared to move with regular infantry and to coordinate militia columns. Local violence raised fear and speed. Armed settlers built blockhouses. Couriers flowed between Galena the lead mines and posts along the Mississippi. On May 14th, militia advance elements misread a Sauk truce party near a creek later called Stillmans Run. Shots were fired. The militia line broke in panic. 11 died in the rout. The event flooded the muster rolls and locked the campaign into a pursuit. Objectives on the United States side were clear: enforce the 1804 treaty, protect settlements along the Rock River, drive the British band back across the Mississippi, avoid a wider coalition with Potawatomi or Ho-Chunk villages. Constraints were real. Many volunteers were green and elected their officers. Coordination between mounted brigades and regulars was uneven. Spring floods slowed wagon trains and swelled fords. Patrols often outran rations. Logistics favored the pursuers over time. Fort Armstrong on Rock Island served as a base with depots and boats. Steamboats on the Mississippi moved flour powder and lead shot with speed once water levels permitted. Galena supplied horse tack and volunteer gear. Detachments of the 1st Infantry and 6th Infantry carried the standard small arms and ammunition allowances. By June, several thousand mounted volunteers could sweep prairies in wide arcs and then fall back on rivers for resupply. Objectives on the British band side were concrete and limited: reach old cornfields near Saukenuk, secure food for spring and summer, seek protection from Allied villages on the Rock River, avoid a pitched battle with superior numbers, preserve families and elders during movement. Constraints were severe. Ammunition stocks were finite and hard to replace. Many ponies were poor after winter. Canoes and rafts were scarce away from the main rivers. Every march had to consider children and baggage. True coalition support never formed at scale. The strategic balance set by these causes shaped every later move. A paper deed from 1804 met removal policy from 1830. Mines and farms fixed new interests on the Rock River. Administration under the War Department delivered orders with food and powder behind them. A single false contact at Stillmans Run turned a tense migration into a 4-month chase toward the Mississippi. Mid-May 1832 opened with cold rain across the Rock River country and fields not yet planted. After the panic at the creek later called Stillmans Run, the countryside moved on rumor. Couriers from Fort Armstrong rode clay roads to the Rock Island Agency and on to Galena, where the lead mines district emptied men into mounted companies. Interpreters moved with each column passing Sauk and Meskwaki names through English and French. Antoine Leclerc carried messages between officers and native envoys, and translated warnings that no broad alliance stood ready upriver. Atkinson pushed slow because supply boats on the Mississippi lagged in the swollen channel. The British band moved fast because hunger pressed, and because the first fight had shown that militia could be broken when surprised. The pressure rose not from a single blow, but from a run of incidents that fixed fear on both sides and closed the band's options. May 21st set the tone far from any command post. Along Indian Creek, a mill race dispute and old grievances broke into sudden violence. A group of Potawatomi men, some with ties to the Prophet's Circle, struck a small settlement. 15 settlers died. The ground was soft and the creek ran high with spring runoff. Word reached Galena and then Springfield by express riders on spent horses. The story hardened opinion and erased any thin distinction between the British band's movement and wider native anger across northern Illinois. Blockhouses went up at bends in the road. Small cabins became posts with firing slits. Families left outlying farms and crowded into makeshift forts near groves and ferry points. Local commanders seized spare horses and wagons, and militia parties detained native visitors who could not explain ties to recognized villages. The agency at Rock Island recorded pleas from Keokuk to keep his people out of the path of patrols while he tried to hold a fragile peace west of the river. In the same week, Wabokieshiek's influence kept British band scouts in contact with Ho-Chunk and mixed villages near Lake Koshkonong, but no mass uprising followed. The net result was an expansion of the theater and a surge in militia numbers that made a quiet return to the Mississippi even less likely. By early June, the campaign had a rhythm. Mounted brigades scouted in long arcs from the mines and from the lower Rock River, while Atkinson worked to bring regulars and volunteers together. Weather broke into warm days and sudden storms that lifted prairie dust and then turned tracks to gum. Short fights began to punctuate the chase. On June 15th, near Kelloggs Grove, a small party of Sauk and Meskwaki warriors hit a militia detachment in timbered ground. The attackers used the cover of oaks and the folds of a low ridge to force close fire, then withdrew before larger forces arrived. Several militia dead lay in grass wet from the previous night's rain. The incident shook nearby posts and taught the volunteers to hold tighter formations in the open. It also pushed Galena to arm more men to guard the approaches and to keep wagon lines moving with flour and ball for the columns. Every new skirmish generated messages that took a day or more to reach Atkinson. Every delay meant the British band could shift path toward the lakes and marshes where horses sank and wheels broke. 10 days later, the pattern repeated with sharper edges. On June 24th, a war party struck Apple River Fort, a log stockade guarding families and stores a few miles east of Galena. The attack came on a hot day with thunderheads building to the west. Defenders, including women who molded cartridges and carried water, kept up steady fire from firing ports. A courier slipped out under cover of brush and reached Galena, setting off a drum alarm and sending a relief force along the road. The attackers withdrew when the sound of hooves carried on the wind. The immediate effect was local confidence and a firm decision by Galena leaders to hold the mines district while mounted columns continued the chase. The broader effect was more corrosive. Any faint hope that settlers would differentiate between the British band and other native families evaporated. Detachments now stopped canoes on creeks, seized corn in storage pits when they found it, and questioned any small camp near travel routes. For the British band, each raid secured a few sacks of meal or a dozen animals and bought a day of movement. Each raid also added new musters to the list of pursuers. Another fight near Kelloggs Grove on June 25th closed the month with grief and resolve. The militia held a small defensive position and counted their dead with ceremony the next morning. Riders carried names and terse lines of account to newspapers that printed them within a week. The British band kept pushing northeast toward the lakes and the headwaters that feed the Rock and the Wisconsin. Scouts watched for signs of Potawatomi support, and for any Ho-Chunk commitment beyond guides and small food gifts. None of the hoped-for reinforcements materialized at scale. The band's ponies were thin and children rode double. Powder horns were lighter after each close fight. Wabokiechiek urged speed and promised that the woods around Lake Koshkonong could hide families while warriors screened the edges. A contemporary line from the leader himself captures the decision in plain words. Black Hawk autobiography. Prairie du Chien, 1833, I intended to go to the prophet's village on Rock River and there to raise corn. If a war party should come upon us, I would have a chance to defend my people. When the narrative returns to neutral ground, the meaning is simple. The British band wanted food and time under a familiar sky. The United States read the move as a breach and now had the numbers to press the issue. Communications shaped the pace. There was no telegraph on the prairies to collapse time. Messages moved by horse and boat. Interpreters could slow or clarify tense meetings, but the window for parley narrowed after every shot fired at a blockhouse. Atkinson used couriers to bring Dodge and Henry into a loose cordon. Misread trails and false reports cost days, yet the arc of movement bent toward the Wisconsin River because rivers and supply lines dictated where a large force could sustain itself and where a small band could still slip away. As June turned to July, the weather grew hot and the flies thick along marsh edges. The British band shifted campsites more often to keep sickness down. Women searched for edible plants along wet ground and dug for stored corn where old caches might lie. Men hunted deer in scattered groves but found little. Meanwhile, steamboats on the Mississippi began to move more regularly with the summer water level, which meant Atkinson could count on flour and ammunition at points near the Big River. He pressed north in a sequence of consolidations, choosing to keep his columns fed and together rather than gamble on a fast strike that might leave families to scatter in the woods. The cost was tempo, the gain was certainty. 2 final July incidents tightened the vice. Small skirmishes along the approaches to Lake Koshkonong showed that the British band would not stand unless the safety of families demanded it. Scouts from Dodge's command chased shadows through tamarack and cattail. Shots snapped and then fell away into silence. When a captured messenger revealed that the band meant to turn toward the Wisconsin River, Atkinson accelerated his march. He pulled his regulars into a line that could push the refugees against the water. On the nights before the High Ridge fight that followed, lightning walked the horizon, and rain made the sandy soil heavy. Men on both sides slept in damp blankets. The pursuers now had the river at their back for supply, and at the band's front for a barrier. The immediate effect of weeks of rising incidents was a compression of space and choice. The British band had run out of time to find allies or corn. The next ridge would be defended not for victory, but for delay, and the chase would pass out of skirmish country into the short, hard path that ends at the Mississippi. The order of battle took shape as the chase narrowed toward the Wisconsin. On the United States side, Henry Atkinson coordinated detachments of the 1st Infantry and 6th Infantry with mounted volunteers under Henry Dodge, James, Henry, and Alexander Posey. Field strength fluctuated with musters and furloughs, but by late July, the columns that could close on contact numbered about 1,200 to 1,500 effectives with serviceable mounts and a steady allotment of cartridges from river depots. On the British band side, Black Hawk directed 300 to 500 fighters, screening a column of roughly 1,000 people, including elders, women, and children. Powder was short. Ponies were thin after months of wet marches. The aim on one side was removal across the Mississippi. The aim on the other was food safety and escape to the West Bank alive. Authority for compulsion had been laid down months earlier. The governor of Illinois called out mounted volunteers in April to repel what he called an invasion and to protect the frontier along the Rock River. Atkinson's written instructions through spring and summer were consistent with that line: find the band, compel, return to the west side, and prevent a wider coalition. One brief line from the militia call shows the tone of the orders that followed. You will assemble without delay and be ready to march against hostile bands until they are expelled from the state. John Reynolds' proclamation, April 1832. The march from the lakes to the Wisconsin ran through choke points that favored the pursuers. From the marsh country around Lake Koshkonong, the British band threaded tamarack and alder to keep the main body screened. Scouts left false trails on sandy rises where hoof marks could be salted with extra prints. Dodge and Henry drove broad arcs to catch crossings on creeks that ran to the Wisconsin. The weather turned close and hot. Storms slicked the ridges by night. By day, mosquitoes rose in clouds over low ground. Couriers bounced between the mounted brigades and Atkinson's regulars, with hours lost at each flooded ford. When a captured note hinted at a push toward the high bank above the Wisconsin River, the columns converged. July 21, 1832, broke clear over the long slope to the Wisconsin. The British band formed on a dry ridge above Marsh, where the river's wide plain began. Families were already drifting toward the waterline with bundles and makeshift rafts. A small rear guard under seasoned men chose ground that gave them fields of fire across open sedge. Dodge's advance elements touched the line first. Henry's men dressed in on the left. The fight at Wisconsin Heights lasted the better part of an afternoon, in pauses of smoke and bursts of close fire. Militia officers tried to turn the right with dismounted volleys and to press the center when returns slackened. The rear guard answered with aimed shots and short rushes that traded distance for time. Casualties on the United States side were limited, perhaps a handful killed, and a dozen wounded in scattered companies. Estimates for the British band vary from a few to several dozen, based on later accounts by Patrick Young and Roger Nichols. What does not vary is the tactical intent. The ridge was held to buy darkness. When the light failed, women and children crossed on rafts and by swimming ponies in teams with baggage lashed high. Warriors slipped off the ridge before dawn and followed. An after-action line in Atkinson's voice is plain about the purpose of the pressure that followed. We must press them to the river and prevent their recrossing. Henry Atkinson Field Instruction, late July 1832. In the days after Wisconsin Heights, the converging columns moved down the north bank toward the broad elbow where the Bad Axe River meets the Mississippi. Supply now lay with the pursuers. Steamboats found depth in the main channel. Kettles, flour, and fixed cartridges could be landed at short notice wherever bluffs broke for a landing. For the British band, every meal was a contest. Deer were scarce along beaten paths. Caches of corn were few and often empty. Children rode double or walked when ponies failed. The line of march grew ragged, but did not break. Men scouted ahead for drift logs, sound, timber, and rope to build rafts in the last bend before the big river. August 1st opened heavy and hot at the mouth of the Bad Axe. The steamboat Warrior came down the channel with a light piece mounted and small arms on deck. Accounts from the boat's officers claimed a parley was attempted and not understood. Then a volley was fired from the bank, and the boat returned fire with canister and musketry before withdrawing to refuel. Native witnesses later insisted that a white flag was raised and that fire from the boat cut into people who were trying to surrender or cross. The fact and folklore dispute centers on noise-distance smoke and intention on a windy river mouth. All agree that the exchange added bodies to the bank and left the refugees in shock on the eve of the final blow. Atkinson reached the confluence with his regulars and volunteers on August 2nd. He formed a line to drive the bank and to deny any organized escape to the north or east. The rules of contact on the ground were set by months of fear and by orders that prioritized expulsion over negotiation. Small parties of Ho-Chunk who had earlier offered guides or food now stood aside. Dakota warriors hostile to the Sauk and Meskwaki harried stragglers upriver on old terms of intertribal violence. When the column stepped off the bank, exploded in pockets of fire. Some of the British band tried to force rafts into the river under fire. Some scattered into the woods that run up from the mouth. Some held in small groups and returned shots until powder was gone. The warrior returned during the day and fired again. The pursuit element on shore pushed people into steep ground, broken by ravines where direction failed. A few dozen made the crossing with help from friends on the west bank. Many died in the water. Casualty numbers at Bad Axe are estimates with wide ranges. Contemporary military reports counted United States losses, as small often summarized as fewer than 20 killed and a few dozen wounded. Estimates for native losses run from 150 to 300 dead when river and bank are combined with later syntheses by Nichols and Young, noting the uncertainty because many bodies were carried downstream or taken away by kin. What is not in dispute is that non-combatants were among the dead. After the fight, United States detachments took prisoners where they could provide a measure of food and medical attention and escorted survivors to posts on the Mississippi. The humanitarian outcome was still terrible. Families were broken, children were separated, and later counted in agency returns. The river carried away the uncounted. Logistics as ever decided much of the shape of the day. The United States columns entered the field with dry cartridges and steady resupply from the river. Their mounts were tired, but they could be watered and fed from stores landed by boat. The British band fired the last cartridges in their horns and broke open old loads to make a few more. Rafts were built from whatever could be cut and tied under pressure. There was no reserve of food or ammunition. The mechanics of pursuit overwhelmed the mechanics of flight. In the late afternoon, organized resistance faded. Searchers found wrecked rafts along the bank and shallow graves in soft soil. Parties swept the bottoms for 2 days after the main action to collect prisoners and to ensure no large body remained. Atkinson's formal report emphasized that the object of the campaign had been achieved. The band had been destroyed as a threat and the crossing secured. In the weeks that followed, Black Hawk was taken west under guard toward Prairie du Chien. He surrendered there in late August to Indian Agent Joseph Street with interpreter Antoine Leclerc present to formalize words and names. Officers, including Zachary Taylor, managed transfers and paroles. Surviving families were counted and moved under agency control. Across this campaign path, the legal and military strands stayed braided. The doctrine of removal under federal law framed objectives. The state call for volunteers supplied mass. Army command and river logistics supplied endurance and reach. Where policy met terrain, the results were not abstract. They were the mud of the Rock River trails, the heat and flies on the Wisconsin marsh, the splinters of rafts at the mouth of the Bad Axe. 2 brief disputes remain at the edge of fact and folklore. One is the depth of support the British band expected from Potawatomi or Ho-Chunk villages. Signals moved and small help arrived, but no large alliance ever formed at the point of decision. The other is the white flag at Bad Axe. Native survivors said it was raised and not honored. Boat and shore officers said they faced fire first, or could not see a parley in time. The record offers evidence for both claims and gives certainty only on the outcome. What endures in the documents is the through line of orders and the weight of logistics. The April proclamation that brought men to horses. The field instruction to press to the river and deny the crossing. The measured post-action reports that list small United States losses and large native dead with the caveat that numbers are uncertain. Set against those papers are the lived facts of non-combatants on the move and the final compression of time and space at a river mouth. The combat path from Wisconsin Heights to Bad Axe explains why the pursuit did not stop until it reached the Mississippi and why once there, it ended in a scene that later generations would argue over in print while the current swept past the bluffs toward the south. Late afternoon, 23 July, 1832, high ground above the Wisconsin River near present-day Sauk Prairie. Black Hawk held a dry ridge with 300 to 500 fighters screening roughly 1,000 people on the move. Across the marsh, Henry Dodge and James Henry aligned about 1,000 mounted volunteers with detachments of regulars under Henry Atkinson closing from the south. Each side's objectives were simple. The British band needed hours to get families and baggage across the Wisconsin. The United States columns needed to deny that crossing and compress the refugees against the Mississippi within days. Constraints set the tone. Ammunition among Black Hawk's men was low after weeks of skirmishing. Powder horns were light, and ball had been recast from old loads. Rations were worse. Women had been digging for stored corn in abandoned caches and boiling thin broths from scraps of venison. Ponies were underfed and children rode double. On the United States side, cartridges were dry, resupply was now within reach of steamboats on the Mississippi, and horse forage could be landed at short notice. Yet there were limits. Elected militia officers still learned, and contact couriers lost hours at flooded fords, and summer storms made the sandy soil heavy. Orders were crisp in their intent. Atkinson's field instruction after the ridge fight reduced the mission to a line, press them to the river, and prevent their recrossing. The immediate effect at Wisconsin Heights was an initiative shift built on time rather than terrain. Black Hawk's rear guard used the ridge and the wet sedge below it to trade distance for darkness, firing measured shots and yielding ground only when pressure built. That choice bought a night. Under cover of rain and wind, women and children ferried the Wisconsin on rafts of lashed logs and by swimming ponies with bundles tied high. Before dawn, the fighters slipped off the ridge. It was a tactical stand designed for a strategic withdrawal, and it worked for one cycle of light. The cost of that success fixed the greater outcome. Ammunition expended on the ridge could not be replaced. Breadth of movement narrowed once the crossing committed the band to the long run down the Wisconsin Valley toward the Mississippi. Meanwhile, the pursuers gained their best logistics of the campaign. The river behind them ran with boats that could carry flour and fixed cartridges. Columns that had been careful about tempo could now move with certainty. From this point, delay for the refugees meant attrition without relief. Delay for the pursuers meant only a longer march with full kettles. 2 days later, the convergence was set. Columns moved on parallel lines to the west bank. Scouts kept contact with a thin screen of warriors who were now preserving powder for a final defense of rafts. August 1st brought a harsh preview at the mouth of the Bad Axe when the steamboat warrior exchanged fire with figures on the bank. Accounts disagree on whether a parley was visible or fire came first, but all agree that people died on the shoreline and in the shoals before the main force arrived. When Atkinson closed on August 2nd, he aligned a drive along the bank while the warrior returned to rake the waterline. Under that pressure, some of the British band tried to push rafts into the current. Some fled into ravines, and some held in small clusters until the last cartridges were gone. The initiative that had been saved at Wisconsin Heights dissolved in the face of fresh ammunition deck guns and a blocked crossing. Organized resistance ended by afternoon. An admission against interest from the leader who chose the ridge lays out the miscalculation that led to this turn. Black Hawk Autobiography, Prairie du Chien 33. I expected to be joined by the Potawatomi and the Winnebago when I reached the Rock River. I was disappointed. I found no help, and our women and children were hungry. Had a different chain of facts aligned, a limited counterfactual exists. If the mounted columns had attacked the ridge at Wisconsin Heights in piecemeal rushes and been thrown back a second night, might have opened, and with it, a wider gap between the refugees and the pursuing line. If the Mississippi had lacked armed boats in the first week of August, a crossing on improvised rafts in morning fog might have carried several hundred across before the main force arrived. Those possibilities depend on two variables that the record does not support. After late July, steady United States coordination and steamboat presence were both real and improving, while British band ammunition and food were both failing. The human cost centers the turning point more clearly than maps can. On the ridge, named and unnamed men fell into sedge and oak shadow to buy hours for families they would not see again. Among the militia, the dead from Kelloggs Grove buried only days earlier still shaped resolve. Their names ran in newspapers and letters that reached farms and towns, bringing new riders to the musters. At Bad Axe, the dead included women with children on their backs in the water and elders who could not climb the bluffs. A few are named in agency returns, many are not. Winter count motifs later remembered a river mouth and broken rafts rather than banners or captured cannon. The displacement path that followed ran through Prairie du Chien under Guard East for a season, to cities where Black Hawk was shown the scale of the United States, then back west to lands further removed from cornfields at Sauk. The Sauk and Meskwaki, who had followed Keokuk, remained on assigned tracks for a time, then signed away more ground as pressure returned with surveys and sales. Numbers framed the hinge without drama. United States casualties from Wisconsin Heights through Bad Axe were small, often listed as fewer than 20 killed and several dozen wounded across scattered companies. Native casualties at Bad Axe are estimated in ranges of 150 to 300 dead because many bodies were lost to the current or buried in haste. The disparity reflects not only fire superiority at the last fight, but the exhaustion of a column that had been living by short rations since May. Synthesis brings the scene back to the structural forces set in motion before a single shot in 1832. The 1804 St. Louis cession gave the United States a legal frame to treat return to Sauk as a breach. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 gave policy muscle to removal orders. Settlement pressure from farms and lead mines fixed local political will to answer every alarm with more mounted men. Administration under the War Department and the Rock Island Agency delivered orders, annuities, and ration leverage. Those deep causes met immediate constraints in July, powder and corn on one side, cartridges and steamboats on the other. Wisconsin Heights was the last moment when tactics could bend time. Bad Axe was the moment when logistics erased that bend. The turning point, therefore, is not a single volley or a dramatic charge, but a sequence of linked limits. A ridge that bought a night at the cost of powder. A river that could be crossed only under fire because boats had arrived. A policy that defined success as removal, paired with a command whose supply lines finally ran on water. From these facts, the outcome followed. Initiative slid from a skilled rearguard to a fed pursuit. The breakout became a stand, the stand became a withdrawal, and the withdrawal ended as surrender. The fighting stopped at the river, but the paperwork began at once. Within days of the Bad Axe killings, prisoners were tallied at Prairie du Chien and moved under guard. Black Hawk and several leaders were confined first at Fort Crawford and then transferred to Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis, where officers recorded statements and arranged interrogations through interpreters. In April 1833, federal officials sent a small escorted party east by steamboat and coach. In Washington, the captives met Andrew Jackson and cabinet secretaries. In Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, they were displayed to crowds that newspapers described in tones of triumph. These movements appear in Army correspondence from August 1832 to June 1833, and in notices carried by Niles' Weekly Register across that spring. Black Hawk later set down his account with the help of an amanuensis, creating a narrative that confirms the tour's route and mood while disagreeing with official motives. The legal settlement took shape in two treaties signed in September 1832 at Fort Armstrong on Rock Island, usually called the Black Hawk Purchase and Associated Agreements. Keokuk led the Sauk and Meskwaki signers. The cessions opened a wide strip west of the Mississippi in what would become Iowa Territory, reserved several small parcels for agency and military use, and recognized a limited tract where the Sauk and Meskwaki could live under federal oversight. The text appears in the Federal Treaty Series and is summarized in the Office of Indian Affairs Annual Report for 1832 to 1833. A companion treaty with the Ho-Chunk that autumn ordered removals from lead districts around the mines. Together, these instruments converted a summer's campaign into a land market. Warrants for survey followed in 1833 and 1834, and deputies carried chains across river bottoms where rafts had broken only weeks before. Administration tightened as law followed the flag. The Rock Island Agency issued ration schedules, paid annuities stipulated by earlier deeds, and enforced travel passes. Army officers at Fort Armstrong and later at Fort Des Moines conducted arrests for drunkenness, theft, and intertribal reprisals that flared during the unsettled winter of 1832 to 1833. Returns preserved in the Indian Office show fluctuating headcounts as small families slipped between river posts and hunting camps. Missionaries petitioned for funds to teach English and agriculture. Their letters appear in the American Board Archives and in the annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for 1834, which highlights plans for schoolhouses and fields laid out in rectangles rather than in the older village patterns along bends and terraces. Resource pressure deepened the administrative track. The Galena Lead region expanded with leases and licenses that federal officials renewed at regular intervals. Production statistics in Treasury and War Department tables show output rising through the 1830s. New ferry rights crossed the Mississippi to town sites that were now legal to plat on the Iowa shore. By the late 1830s, county roads reached the old treaty line, and the first steamboat landings fixed the future positions of river towns. Railroad surveys in the 1850s, recorded in state engineering reports, aimed spurs at these landings. Grazing and woodlots on the Iowa side shifted hands quickly as land offices opened. The people who had given the cession became tenants or dependents along the same water where they had planted corn. Demography bore the costs. Agency censuses after 1832 show Sauk and Meskwaki numbers declining through the decade, as winter illness and flight to distant kin took their toll. The cholera waves of 1832 and 1833, noted in Army medical returns and frontier news columns, struck hard in river districts where troops and steamboats concentrated. Births recovered slowly. Several families that had followed Keokuk west of the river made seasonal hunts but returned for rations. Others moved farther toward the Des Moines River country. By 1842, pressure from settlers and federal negotiators produced another cession that cleared Iowa lands and sent most Sauk and Meskwaki to Kansas by 1845, a sequence laid out in treaty texts and the commissioner's reports of those years. Mortality rose again during the first Kansas winters as timber was scarce and agency deliveries lagged. School placements and labor policy tracked these moves. Mission schools along the Mississippi taught in English with manual training, Later, after 1879, off-reservation boarding schools, such as Carlisle and Haskell, drew children from Sauk and Meskwaki communities under the authority of the Office of Indian Affairs, which measured progress in attendance and English literacy rather than in language or ceremonial knowledge. Annual reports and inspector letters in the 1880s and 1890s described the transfer of children and the penalties for families who resisted. The Dawes Act of 1887 extended allotment across many plains and prairie nations. Land patent lists for the Sac and Fox in Indian Territory show parcels broken into individual holdings and soon after lost to tax sales and fraud. Continuance took other paths. In 1857, a group of Meskwaki families used annuity funds and pooled cash to purchase land in Tama County, Iowa. State acts in 1856 to 1857 permitted that purchase, creating what is now the Meskwaki settlement. The transaction appears in Iowa legislative records and in Indian office correspondence on jurisdiction. There and later in Oklahoma and Kansas, ceremonial life persisted under policy pressure. Green corn rights naming practices and language instruction survived in households and societies even as public ceremonies narrowed. Ethnographic notes gathered in the late 19th century by government collectors and university researchers record songs and terms that bridge the war era and the reservation period. Memory fixed places as much as events. Local histories printed in the 1870s and 1880s placed markers at Wisconsin Heights and near the confluence of the Bad Axe and the Mississippi. County committees raised stones and state parks later standardized signage. Veterans' notices in newspapers remembered the militia dead by name, listing them beside election news and crop prices. Black Hawk died in 1838 in Iowa Territory. Moves of his remains and the fate of his grave goods became a small literature of their own. In county papers and collectors' catalogs, a reminder that even in death, the politics of display did not end. Ledger drawings survive from related nations that visited, worked, or married into Sauk and Meskwaki communities. They preserve scenes of mounted scouts and river crossings in a style that turns tactics into symbols worn on paper. The present carries all of this forward. Autonyms in use today and written here in ASCII are Meskwaki Nation Sac and Fox Tribe of the Mississippi in Iowa, Sac and Fox Nation in Oklahoma, and Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska. The Meskwaki Nation resides at the settlement in Tama County. The Oklahoma Nation holds jurisdiction in central Oklahoma. The Missouri Nation maintains lands in Kansas and Nebraska. Each government operates language programs, cultural centers, and schools. Each runs health services that address diabetes, heart disease, and trauma that public health officers have tracked since the early 20th century. Court dockets show ongoing efforts to protect child welfare jurisdiction under the Indian Child Welfare Act. Compact agreements record cross-deputization and cooperative policing. Cultural departments publish language curricula and hold seasonal gatherings that mark continuity rather than reenactment. 5 records anchor these threads in the written archive. General Henry Atkinson's August 1832 report details the campaign's last marches and the small number of United States casualties. The Treaty of September 21, 1832, at Fort Armstrong sets out the Black Hawk Purchase and the payments that followed. Niles' Weekly Register across 1832-1833 prints militia names, public funerals, and the Eastern tour itinerary for the prisoners. The annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for 1833 lists agency expenditures, school plans, and ration issues along the upper Mississippi. Black Hawk's 1833 autobiography gives the leader's view of hunger, disappointment, and intent, including his admission that no broad alliance formed on the Rock River. Later records trace continuance Iowa legislative acts authorizing the 1857 Meskwaki land purchase, allotment rolls and patent books for Sac and Fox citizens in Indian Territory after 1887, and state park files that maintain the markers at Wisconsin Heights and Bad Axe. What followed the summer of 1832 was not only a line on a map, but a system. Treaties and proclamations transformed river country into schedules of payment, attendance, and travel. Mines, ferries, and later rails converted prairie and timber into leases and receipts. Populations fell, moved, and regrouped. Language and ceremony compressed, then adapted, then revived. The argument that began with a disputed deed in 1804, hardened by the Indian Removal Act in 1830, and enforced by mounted columns and steamboats in 1832, continues today in court filings, schoolrooms, and family kitchens where Meskwaki and Sauk words are spoken. The names of rivers and ridges remain the same. The people who carry them forward do so with governments, programs, and songs that outlast a single campaign season. Across 2 centuries, scholars converge on 3 points. First, the pursuit of Black Hawk's band in 1832 grew from law and logistics more than from battlefield genius. The United States acted under its reading of the 1804 St. Louis cession and the Indian removal policy of 1830. Once mobilized, militia masses, regular detachments, and river transport made a sustained chase inevitable. Second, the decisive mechanism was supply. Steamboats, depots, and cartridges allowed the pursuers to keep tempo, while the British band's powder, food, and ponies failed. Third, the terminal violence at the Bad Axe confluence ended a political possibility. After August 1832, Sauk and Meskwaki, leverage east of the Mississippi, collapsed, and subsequent treaties translated the summer's outcome into survey lines and land sales. Debate persists around numbers and intent. Estimates of native deaths at Bad Axe range widely because water and woods concealed bodies and because contemporary counts were partial. United States casualties are consistently reported as low, but returns vary by company and date. The question of a white flag in Parley on August 1st remains contested. Boat officers reported fire from shore. Native survivors described attempts to surrender or negotiate. The record supports both the confusion of a windy river fight and the structural reality that orders prioritized expulsion over accommodation. Another debate concerns individual roles. Keokuk's accommodationist leadership secured rations and a degree of protection for those who stayed west of the river, yet critics within later generations judged the price as dispossession. Black Hawk's decision to re-enter the Rock River country has been read either as a last attempt to feed and anchor his people in familiar fields or as a miscalculation about allies and American resolve. Historians now tend to place both men within a narrow corridor of options defined by policy and settler pressure rather than by personal failings. The enduring legacy operates in doctrine, reform, and symbol. On the doctrine side, 1832 reinforced a United States frontier pattern. State calls for volunteers backed by small regular cadres, pursuit to a river line, and decisive use of transport to compress space and time. Administrative reform followed as the Office of Indian Affairs tightened ration pass and school systems to prevent renewed East Bank returns. As symbol, the war fixed two images that still shape public memory. One is the ridge at Wisconsin Heights, where a skilled rearguard bought a night for families. The other is the mouth of the Bad Axe, where rafts broke under fire and the river carried away the uncounted. In native and local histories alike, these places mark both tactical clarity and humanitarian catastrophe. Placed in the long arc, the Black Hawk War stands as an inflection between treaty diplomacy and industrial removal. It taught a young republic that rivers and paperwork could enforce conquest with fewer pitched battles, and it taught the Sauk and Meskwaki that survival would require reinvention beyond Salkanuk. The event endures because it shows with dates and rivers and orders how policy married to logistics can erase a homeland in a single season. We saw how a return to fields became a pursuit from the 1804 document to Wisconsin Heights and Bad Axe. In your view, did logistics or orders matter more? Was any real chance to negotiate missed? Thank you for watching.